Well, what about the debt? Because I think one of the things that when I learned how much debt the US is carrying, that was always shocking to me. Because I can't imagine running a business the way that the US government runs their balance sheet, or like having your personal finances be in a position where you're carrying that much debt. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on how do you do debt reduction? Like, does it work the same way in a government standpoint as it would for an individual or a corporate standpoint, or is that like a completely different ballgame?
That the last point you bring up about, is this the same as as a household? Because you hear a lot of people talk like that. Like, imagine you run a household and you run a deficit every year and you have $36 trillion in debt. And that analogy is very appealing to people because they can immediately contextualize how absurd it would be. But no, governments are not households. Here's the very simple difference. There will come a time in my life and your life when all of our debts must be repaid in full. And whether it's when we retire or when we die, the debts we take out have to be repaid. Governments, and by the way, corporations, do not have that. They are perpetual lifespans. They never have to pay off their debts to zero. There will never be a time in our lives or our ancestors' lives, our descendants' lives, when the U.S. has no debt, when it's paid off all of its debt to zero. That will never happen, and it doesn't need to happen because it's a perpetual thing. What matters is that the carrying cost of that debt is within your means. And so look at like very old companies, Ford Motor, General Motors, companies that have been around for more than 100 years. Ford and GM have been in debt for more than 100 years. And if they survive, they'll be in debt for another 100 years. They never have to pay it all off. Of course, the debt that you take out will eventually come due, and you can repay that with new debt that you take off. So it's not to poo-poo debt in the slightest. There's a lot of economic history of countries having debt crises. Of course, you can't just say none of it matters. That's not the point. But it's a very different dynamic than a household. What you need to have in a country is that the carrying costs, the interest cost of that debt is within your means. Now, because interest rates have gone up over the last couple of years, we're getting to the point where interest payments on government debt as a share of GDP are higher than they've been since, I think, the early 1990s. And scheduled to probably go much higher. No one really knows where interest rates are going to go, but scheduled to go much higher. So does the government need to do something about its annual deficit? Absolutely. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. The problem of why nothing's been done about it yet is because, look, it's always when you look at government spending, people look at waste, fraud, and abuse, and they come up with things. Oh, did you know we spend $6 million a year studying frog mating habits, whatever. They come up with things that are like very emotional that are not even rounding errors. The only thing that matters in government spending is Social Security, Medicare, defense, and interest payments, which interest payments is this kind of like a function of everything else that you spend. So the only thing that matters is Medicare, Social Security, defense. Everything else is a rounding error. And those three of entitlements and defense are the things that people have more or less said you cannot touch them. And so it's a nearly impossible solution to fix until there's a crisis. My best guess, and this is just kind of like gun to my head, like how is it going to play out? We will never cut the deficit until we have to. And we'll have to when there's a financial crisis caused by it. But you're never going to preemptively do it because it's virtually impossible for any democratically elected leader in Congress or in the White House to come to people and say, hey, even though interest rates are low and there's no economic crisis, we're going to cut Social Security by 30%. People will be like, no, you won't. Absolutely not. You won't. And so it's virtually impossible to do anything about that until there's a crisis. Now, if there was a crisis and it was like, hey, the global economy, like the US economy is in collapse because interest rates surge because of the deficit. So we're going to cut Social Security then like people can't really push back anymore. And so there are a lot of things in life that people will not make a tough decision until there's a fire underneath their ass. And that's my best guess for how this will play out. It hasn't played out like that yet. The very optimistic scenario, and this actually happened after World War II. At the end of World War II, we had more debt as a share of GDP than we do today. We were just completely buried. So was the UK and United States. Like it was just like a debt catastrophe. And a lot of people at the time very rationally said, the US is never going to pay this off. This is never. And by the way, they were right. We did never pay off the debt from World War II. What we did is we grew the economy so that we could just kind of grow into that debt. And so there's never been a time after World War II where in any given year, the US actually paid down debt. We have never paid down debt in any given year. Debt has gone up every single year. But the debt burden has shifted consistently because look, if the budget deficit as a share of GDP is, let's say it's 3%, but the economy is growing by 5%, then your relative debt burden is shrinking. So the government can spend more than it takes in every single year and decrease the burden of that debt as long as the economy is growing faster. Now that's a big if. It did occur during the 1950s and the 1960s where the debt burden fell, even though we never paid off debt. But right now, in 2024, I think the budget deficit was 6 or 7% of GDP, and the economy is probably growing, 4 or 5% of GDP in nominal terms. So that's a growing burden. So it is absolutely possible to decrease the debt burden through growth, but that's, I think, the opposite of what's occurring right now, which is let's start a trade war and see how quickly we can crash the economy.